Hello out there. So I might just wait a couple of moments to see if anybody else wants to jump on. Hello, thanks for joining me. Hi there. Awesome. Oh, hey Kat, nice to see you. So welcome everyone, and thank you so much to the Yoga Medicine family for allowing me to jump on this live stream. And I'm super honored and thrilled to be bringing you some classes on Yoga Medicine online. So thanks very much, Tiffany and the Yoga Medicine family, for that opportunity. Many of the classes that I've got on the Yoga Medicine site feature a 3-dimensional or 360-degree breathing technique. So I thought I might explain a little bit more about that on this live stream, why I like it so much, and the reasons for using it and why it's so good for things like stabilisation or core stabilisation. So I guess the first thing to kind of really think about or unpack is what exactly is core stabilisation, and what do we actually mean by that? And are we just talking about the abdominals, or are we talking about the whole trunk? Are we talking about the inner unit or the core canister? Or is it the whole deep front line from the arches of your feet all the way up to the throat and all of the structures that are kind of embedded within that? And I really like to think about, excuse me, my voice is going all funny. I like to think about it as those latter two. So really the deep front line and the structures within it, and the core canister or the inner unit, and really the alignment of all of the diaphragms within the body. Now, the reason why I got so passionate about breathing mechanics and core stabilization, and why I've been kind of really delving deep into the science and physiology of breathing over the last few years, is because I realized a few years back that I actually had some issues myself with how I was breathing and how I was stabilizing my body. And this breath pattern that I had created was actually creating issues for my pelvic floor, my SI joint. It was also exacerbating the anxiety that I was experiencing at the time as well. So that's why I kind of started to delve into it. And then as I started to delve into it more, I just find it really fascinating. I love looking at breathing and what is actually physiologically happening, and then how we can guide our students into, really finding a breath pattern that works for them, but also using their innate ability to stabilize. Because often we can kind of over cue a little bit, which messes around with people's breathing mechanics and their ability to innately stabilize the spine. So I really think of breathing as kind of the key to stability in both the body and the mind. So it's not just a physical thing, but also a mental thing as well. So if we look at kind of the anatomy first of breathing, and in particular the relationship between the two kind of main diaphragms, the respiratory diaphragm or the thoracic diaphragm, and the pelvic floor diaphragm. And so ideally we'd like these two to kind of align over the top of one another. So that means that the thorax and the pelvis are kind of aligned. Now, of course, as we move around in space, that's going to not always be the case, but this is kind of the place where we get the optimum ability to create intra-abdominal pressure and core stabilization. Now, the other diaphragm that's also really important is up into the soft palate and the placement of the hyoid bone. And we'll kind of talk about that a little bit later on, but if we just focus on these first two first, I think that will help us kind of understand what's going on. Now, the diaphragm itself, so the respiratory diaphragm, is actually a skeletal muscle, which means that it moves bones. So the bones that it's actually moving are the ribs, because that's where it attaches. So ideally, the diaphragm descends down concentrically. It pulls the ribs down and out, which increases thoracic shape and volume. And that decrease in pressure in our thoracic cavity then draws the air into the lungs. Now, because it's also actually attaching to the facet joints in the spine, in the thoracic spine, it's also moving the spine. when we are moving the full circumference of the diaphragm, which kind of many of us are not, because we get stuck in these short, shallow breathing patterns using more of our accessory muscles up in the neck and the throat. So when we breathe in that three-dimensional way, what happens is the ribs get moved, which then also moves the spine. And remembering that the facet joints are synovial joints, and the way that we lubricate and nourish synovial joints is through movement. So the thoracic spine, particularly T2 to T9, is getting most of its movement from how we breathe, and the flexion that happens on the inhale and the extension on the exhale. Hi, you guys. Which is actually contrary to what we cue a lot of the time. If you think about cat-cow, we're often inhaling into extension and exhaling into flexion. But physiologically, what's happening in the spine when we breathe in is we're going into a little bit of flexion, and it's subtle, and then a little bit of extension as we breathe out. Now, that flexion and extension also allows for better rotation of the thoracic spine. So when I was having all my kind of breathing issues, one thing that had happened for me was my thoracic spine had started to lock up a little. I couldn't rotate so well. And so that was kind of manifesting in lots of shoulder and neck issues for me. Hi, Jolie, nice to have you. So we need the flexion in order to get the rotation. Now, if we look at the movement of these two diaphragms together, so as I breathe in, my respiratory diaphragm concentrically contracts and descends down as the pelvic floor eccentrically contracts and descends down. And then on the exhale, the pelvic floor is going to do the opposite. So it's going to concentrically contract to ascend, and the respiratory diaphragm is going to eccentrically contract to ascend. So ideally, they're kind of moving together in a beautiful rhythm. The exhalation is also helped by the transverse abs and the internal obliques concentrically drawing in to help compress the abdomen, so that then the diaphragm will move up. The thoracic cage or thoracic shape and volume gets smaller, which increases the pressure, which forces the air out. So this is ideally what we want. However, when we pull the belly in, and you can try this now with me, if you pull your belly in, so that's the concentric phase of your transverse abs, just notice what is also happening in your pelvic floor. Can you feel that there is a lifting up or a co-contraction of the pelvic floor in and up? And so if you have a habit or a tendency of pulling the belly in and holding it in, and this was definitely what I was doing all of the time, can you feel how now there is not the space for the respiratory diaphragm now to move down? Because we've compressed the abdomen, so there's not enough space for it to move down. So that means that we're forced to use a little bit more of our accessory muscles to breathe. So we become kind of upper chest breathers, neck breathers. And the interesting thing about the diaphragm is it's also a postural muscle once we stand. So it influences our posture. And it's also very much related to emotion. So, if you get a fright, you often gasp, or if you're crying, you sob, etc. And so, it's used for us to express emotion. And sometimes what happens is life events happen. We maybe gasp or, create a breathing pattern in that moment, and then we get a little bit stuck in that breathing pattern. So whether that is pulling the belly in or, that shorter breath pattern. Now that shorter breath pattern is going to influence the movement of the thoracic cage, and also the movement of the neck and shoulders. And so this is when we get kind of postural changes, like the forward head tilt position, or the open scissors, where the ribs kind of flare open and forward. So that cue of draw the navel towards the spine to protect the lumbar spine, or draw the navel in to stabilize the lumbar spine, is actually a little bit incorrect, and it's not how our bodies innately stabilize. Like if you were to just bend over now and pick something up off the floor that was a little bit heavy, you would actually do an eccentric expansion or contraction of your transverse abs in order to create intra-abdominal pressure to stabilize, to pick up that item. So we'll have a little play with this now, and you can do this with me. You just take your hands around your waist and we'll do a double exhalation so that you can feel the drawing in of these muscles. So if you breathe in normally, and then exhale normally, and then exhale again. Notice what you do around the belly. Let the breath come in naturally. Exhale. And then exhale again. Notice what you're doing around the abdomen. And just do this a couple more times, and if you like, you can post in the comments what you're feeling. And just notice that drawing in, which is the concentric phase of the transverse abs and internal obliques. And then you can let that go, and we'll do the opposite. So keeping your hands on your waist, can you widen into your hands? So it's an eccentric widening out. And you could even do a little gesture with the hands, thinking of kind of widening either side of the belly out to the sides. Or sometimes I like to do it as little kind of trampoline fingers. So if you take your fingers and just kind of bounce up and down on the belly, and notice what you do to prevent your fingers from sinking in. So it's kind of that subtle eccentric expansion out, and that's really what we do innately to stabilize our lumbar spine. So oftentimes the cues that we can be using can be messing up our body's innate capacity to stabilize. And remember that the core is reflexive, so it's happening without us having to think about it, ideally. And it is happening, well, it's tailored to the task at hand. So in other words, I'm not going to do a maximum eccentric isometric contraction out if I'm only picking up, say, my phone off the floor. So it's going to be tailored to the task at hand. And sometimes we can, be doing too much for what we are, perhaps doing in our yoga practice even. So the first thing really we want is the belly and the pelvic floor to be relaxed so that these two diaphragms are now moving in conjunction with one another. And so for me, what I had created was this pattern of constantly holding the belly in. And that's part and parcel. I grew up as a dancer, and so we were always cued to pull the navel towards the spine, flat belly, all of that kind of stuff. It's also kind of tied up really with the society we live in. We kind of prize this whole like flatter tummy scenario rather than actually allowing the belly to just move in and out with the breath. First thing is really to enable the belly to move, and then to see if we can move the breath into all sides of the ribs so that we get the back of the diaphragm to move just as much as the front. And in actual fact, the back of the diaphragm has the capacity to move much more than the front of the diaphragm. So I think it's around about 6 to 8 centimeters it will descend down at the back, and around about 3 to 5 centimeters in the front. So we're going to do a little practice with that in a second. The other thing about drawing the belly in and holding it in and the pelvic floor constantly lifted is it's a little bit like walking around with my bicep only in this contraction. So not that helpful if I want to eccentrically lengthen the bicep to then pick something up off the floor, nor is it that helpful if I want to bring something a little closer towards me or, contract a little deeper into that muscle. So we end up only using a small portion of the muscle, so the pelvic floor, transverse abs. We get a kind of hypertonicity around that area, but then sensory motor amnesia at the other end, so that ability to eccentrically lengthen or contract a little deeper. So this is why, being able to relax enables us, or eccentrically lengthen the pelvic floor enables us to then create a fuller contraction, so then things like leakage don't become a problem. Now, the other interesting thing about breathing is that just like we're a kind of pressure differential to bring air in, this also works in terms of moving blood around the body. And so this is called hemodynamics. And so when we are breathing three-dimensionally and a little slower, what happens is it sets up the conditions for better return of blood back to the heart, because it's working on a pressure system, or hemodynamics. And what the studies have shown is that around kind of 5.5 to 6 breaths per minute is sort of the optimum for enabling that pressure differential to be at its best, or most optimum for cardiovascular resonance. Breathing through the nose is also key because it will help slow down the rate that you are breathing. It's also going to warm and humidify the air before it reaches your lungs, and it also cleans the air. There's also nitric oxide that is produced in your paranasal sinuses, and that helps the capillaries to dilate and the oxygen to be delivered much more easily to the cells and the tissues. So yeah, lots of really good reasons for trying to get the breath to move more into that full circumference of the rib cage, for core stabilisation, for hemodynamics, for oxygenating the cells, etc. The other structure that I mentioned earlier that's also quite important is the position of the head, or the soft palate and the hyoid bone. So I always remember Tiffany mentioning, smiling the hyoid bone, and that's always stuck with me, this idea of drawing it in and up, or the base of the skull back and up. And what you're essentially doing is then aligning the diaphragms again in the body. And you can try this for yourself. If you stick your head forward, notice what's happening through the belly, through the neck and the shoulders, and notice how it is to breathe. And then if you draw your chin in, so smile the hyoid or base of the skull back and up, now notice what happens to the belly, notice what happens to the shoulders, and notice how it feels to breathe. I like to do this in class. I call this a saggy cow. You can try this with me. So if you come into all fours and then do that same thing through the head. So if you just let the head drop forward into that kind of forward head tilt position, and then notice what's happening in and around your shoulders and your upper back. Notice what's happening in and around the belly. And then start to draw your chin in the base of the skull, back and up, until you find that place where the shoulders and the upper back feel supported. And you notice there's a kind of light tone in the belly, but you're not drawing the belly in. And then again, notice how it feels to breathe in that position versus the saggy cow position. So it's just a nice way to kind of bring it into the practice and really notice the difference when we align the head or align the diaphragms in that way. So if you want to grab a band or a strap, we'll do a little practice of three-dimensional breathing and then take it into a little bit of core work and a couple of standing poses before we finish off. So I like to use a TheraBand, but you don't have to use a TheraBand. It could just be a strap if that's all you've got. And you're going to wrap the band around the kind of bottom of your ribs, so sort of where your bra strap would be, or if you kind of feel where your xiphoid process is, so that kind of little sticky out bit on the bottom of your sternum, and then cross over around that point. And so it's just a light cross, and we're trying to get as much of the ribs pressing into this band as possible, so as much surface area touching the band. And you can keep your eyes open, or you could soften your gaze down towards the floor, or close the eyes completely. And just take a moment to check in and notice where you feel the breath first. So before you even change it, just notice what your natural tendency is. Do the shoulders maybe rise and fall with your breath? Is there a little bit of head movement? Do you feel the breath more in your upper chest or underneath your collarbones? Do you feel it more in the front body, the belly? Thanks, Yoga Ascend. So just notice what you feel right now before we alter or change it in any way. And now see if you can direct your awareness into the back body, so where the strap is resting on your back rib space. And then see if you can start to breathe into the back. So feeling the back ribs expand, the side ribs expand. And the belly will naturally rise and fall with the breath. So don't do anything with the belly. Don't forcibly pull in or draw navel to spine or anything like that. Just allow the belly to be soft as you breathe into the back ribs, the side ribs. And if you've never done this before, sometimes it can be a little tricky to get the back body to move. You know, anything on the back body is a little bit harder for us to kind of connect with. So it takes a little bit more mindfulness. Where am I from? I'm from New Zealand. And as you start to get the back body to move, can you notice that subtle movement of the spine? So that subtle flexion on inhale and the extension on exhale. And just notice how that feels. Remembering that the flexion gives us access to better rotation as well. So let's play with a little bit of that now. So rather than going just into the back body, I want you to close down the right side ribs and just breathe into the left side. So the air is still going into both lungs, but you're essentially isometrically holding down the ribs, the intercostals on the right-hand side, so just the left side ribs expand. And just notice what happens as you do that. You might even notice some little clicks and pops in the back, a little defixation of the ribs against the facet joints. Yes, we will save it. And then can you also notice the subtle movement of the spine again? Can you feel how it's pulling you into a really subtle rotation? And then close down your left side ribs and just breathe into the right. And notice how that feels as you just breathe into the right side. Is it easier than breathing into the left? Do you find there's more movement or less movement? We often have one side that's a little bit easier to direct the breath into, so just notice that. Our diaphragm is actually really two hemidiaphragms, and on one side it is actually more in a position of exhalation and the other it's more in a position of inhalation. So you may just notice that there's that a little bit of asymmetry as you try and breathe into one side versus the other. Good, and then go back to breathing into all sides again. So into the back and the sides. Feeling the natural flexion and extension. And then see if you can keep that and just drop the strap down. So doing it without the feedback of the strap. So just your mindful awareness into the back body. Just notice how the breath feels now in comparison to when you first paid attention to it. And then bring yourself into all fours. And we'll play around with this idea of stabilisation or core stabilisation without needing to cue it so much. So hopefully you can see me okay. So tabletop position, just find a little bit of cat pose, a little sense of rounding into the upper back, and then again, fill into that space with the breath. You might notice that there's a little bit more flexion as you breathe in. And then just keep this awareness in the back body as you breathe. See if you can float just your left hand away from the floor. And notice what the right side of your belly is doing in order to stabilize. And then place the hand back down. Extend your left leg back behind you. And this time push into the hands, push into the left foot. Keep breathing into the back body and see if you can hover the right knee just above the floor. And again, pay attention to what's happening through the belly. So notice I didn't cue you to do anything, but your body is naturally finding stabilization. That eccentric expansion of the transverse abs. Good, rest. Come back to all fours. If you need to, just roll out the wrists a little. And then come back to tabletop, and let's play with a little bit of rotation, but we're going to use more of the breath to rotate the spine. So if you bring your right hand into the center and take the left hand just behind your head, and then twist just about a quarter of the way. So not a full twist, just about quarter of what your maximum. So if this was your kind of maximum, you're just dialing it down to about quarter. And then I want you to put your awareness in the right side of your ribs. Left side is going to stay down, so just like we practice with the strap, but the right side, every breath in, can you expand the right side ribs a little more? And as you breathe into the right side and keep this left side contracted down, or the intercostals isometrically holding the rib cage down, can you notice that there is a subtle rotation that happens? And so this rotation is coming from deep within, rather than the kind of more superficial muscles that we like to twist with. We're finding those really deep internal obliques, using the breath to create the movement. And then release from that. And again, you might like to sit back and just roll out that right wrist. And then come up to stand, and we'll try the same thing but in a standing pose. So if you widen your stance and come into extended warrior, Parsvakonasana, just bring the hand onto the thigh for this one. And notice as you bring that hand down, natural tendency is kind of to have the rib cage a little bit more diagonally pointed down. Now for this, if you like, you can bring your left hand onto the right rib so you've got that tactile feedback, something that you can breathe into. Or you can just place the hand on the waist. Now again, the left side ribs are going to stay down, so we're not going to allow the expansion into those ribs, but we're going to focus on just breathing into this right side. As you breathe into the right side, remembering we're trying to get it to the side, but also into the back right side as well. And at the same time, keeping the left side down. So you can almost think of the exhale going down this left leg into the floor. And you might be feeling a little bit more work through the legs. And just notice how there is that really subtle, slow twist of the body, but coming from deep within. Good, and let's come out of that before the right leg dies a little. Give your legs a little shake. So this is how you can kind of bring this three-dimensional breath into the practice to help facilitate more ease in rotational poses, but also more of that kind of internal work to even do things like Trikonasana and Parsvakonasana. The other great way that I like to teach this, particularly for beginners, is the prone version. You may have seen this, it's sometimes called Crocodile Breath. So you lie down on the belly and stack the hands and rest the forehead in the hands. And the great thing about this is you've got the tactile feedback of the floor, so you can feel the belly rise and fall against the floor. And because you're not having to hold yourself up in gravity, you don't have to worry about any of your postural tendencies. You can really focus on the back body expanding. It's also a really great calming position for your nervous system. So really good for beginners or anybody who's maybe a little bit anxious about breathing. Is a great way for them to learn how to breathe into the back body in a kind of safe and supportive way. So I think that's all I really wanted to share with you on this Instagram Live. I hope it's been helpful. Do I do throat exercises? What do you mean by throat exercises? Like drawing the chin in? That kind of stuff? Might just need a little bit more information about that. Let me see. All right, so yeah, that's pretty much it. If you've got any questions, feel free to reach out. Check out my classes on Yoga Medicine Online. You'll see this three-dimensional breath pattern at work in a lot of the poses. And yeah, please reach out if you've got any questions. yogawithkylie@gmail.com or yogawithkylie on Instagram. Thank you so much, and thank you Yoga Medicine for this opportunity. Hari Om Tat Sat. See you guys. Oh, thank you guys. Thanks, Kat. Thanks. Nice to have you guys. Bye, everyone. Bye, Juliet. Can tell I'm a total newbie at this. I'm trying to work out how to stop this now.